Frank R. Baker, as I mentioned, is the Minister Counselor from the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. His expertise in U.S. policy in relation to the United States is his primary focus, as well as interest in transatlantic relations, the Iraq War, Iranian nuclear issues, Afghanistan, the Middle East peace process, and the future of Europe. So in essence, everything you want to know about. Mr. Baker has been a member of the British Diplomatic Corps for 25 years, including service in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Panama City, Panama, and Ankara, Turkey. Prior to his current appointment, he was head of the African Department at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. He enjoys golf, cricket, watching football, rock music, sailing, and rallying. Baker and his wife, Maria Pilar Fernandez, are the parents of one son and one daughter. I believe he will be modifying the title of his topic just one bit, but we are very pleased, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Frank R. Baker.
Thank you very much, Corrie. And maybe I can begin by expressing my thanks again to Corrie and his colleagues for giving me the opportunity to speak here at the David Kennedy Centre for International Studies. It has a great reputation, distinguished record in the study and research of international relations, and which has brought real intellectual fulfilment to those who have been lucky enough to study here. So for me, it's a real honour to be able to address you today. It's also good for me to be in Utah. I did visit the south of Utah some years ago, about 10 years ago, but this was my first visit to Salt Lake City and its environs. And I always make a point before I go anywhere new in the United States, and to be perfectly honest, I'm beginning to run out of places to go because I've now visited, I think, 44 of the 50 states. So, but nevertheless, there's still those 6 out there to do. But I always make a point of doing a little bit of reading, a bit of research into the place that I'm visiting, and especially with a view to seeing how British it is. And I came up with some very interesting facts when I was looking at Salt Lake City, and I'd share one or two of these with you before I get into the main body of the speech. The first one is that, of course, the mines around here were all developed in the late 19th century by Welsh and Cornish miners. Secondly, that the first mayor of Salt Lake City was a Welshman, Dan Jones, and I'm sure you all knew that. And finally, that the state of Utah has, apparently, according to the government statistics, US government statistics, the largest percentage of residents who claim British ancestry. So I do really feel right at home in this state. As Dr. Leonard said, I want to talk today a little bit about really about the transatlantic relationship. I think transatlantic relations, that is the relationship between Europe and the United States, rather than just focusing on the UK, and particularly now that the UK is such an important member, large member of the European Union. And what I'd like to do is to reflect, to begin with, on the changes that have been taking place in Europe and in the United States over the last few years, and to suggest then how we might try to shape and exploit the relationship for the immediate future, particularly in the field of foreign policy, but more widely in international studies. And it was, I begin with a quote from that distinguished former US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, whom, incidentally, I worked for. I spent 2 years working in the US State Department in the 1990s on Iraq and worked very closely with Secretary Albright when she held that position. But she said, one of her best-known quotes is that to understand Europe, you have to be a genius or French. Now, I personally wouldn't go that far. Largely because I'm neither a genius nor am I French, and I would like to persuade you today that I do have some understanding of Europe. But I do know that Europe often does seem opaque to Americans, and as I travel around this country, that does become very clear to me, and that Europe can often be misunderstood. And so clearing up transatlantic misperceptions, tackling that incomprehension, whether in the US or indeed back in Europe, in my own country included, is vitally important as we move forward together. In fact, I would argue that it is imperative if we are to construct a common agenda and pursue it with common purpose. Europe and the US have a common vision of the sort of peaceful, prosperous and democratic world we would like to inhabit. We also have common enemies who use terrorism against us in an effort to impose an extremist, intolerant world of their own. We need to acknowledge the recent tensions across the Atlantic, find ways of resolving them, and find ways of sustaining and renewing what has been and remains an extraordinary partnership. But let's take a little look back first. What are transatlantic relations? Well, transatlantic relations in the second half of the 20th century, of course, were really forged in response to the threat posed after World War II by an expansionist Soviet Union, bent on exporting its version of communism and its influence as widely as possible. And indeed, 20 years ago, we did not really have transatlantic relations in the term that we now understand them, indeed as a concept even. We had the North Atlantic, as in the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and we had, more importantly, the West. Europe was divided. Soviet troops were massed on one side, our own troops were on the other, and the threat was about the Cold War turning into a hot war. Rudyard Kipling once said, in a totally different context, but nevertheless very relevantly to this to the situation we found ourselves in some 20 years ago, East is East, West is West, and never the twain shall meet. And the Western Alliance was the bulwark against the Soviet Union for 50 years. It allowed Europe to rebuild in the aftermath of World War II in close partnership with the United States, and it was a bulwark that held. Ultimately, as we now know, it was the Marxist-Leninist system, not the capitalist system, that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But it was in that moment of triumph, 20 years ago, that the fault lines first began to appear in the transatlantic relationship. With the Soviet Union confined to the history books, the shared common threat, the glue that had bound that transatlantic alliance together over 50 years, disappeared. And there was no obvious threat then to replace it. And even worse, for supporters of that transatlantic relationship, the disappearance of the external Soviet threat coincided with some major political shifts on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, the demographics were changing. For many years, the main body of immigrants into the US had come from Europe, but the last part of the 20th century saw a huge increase in immigration from Latin America, and that led to a shift of focus. Commentators began to ask, quite reasonably, whether in a post-Cold War the US would and should pay more attention to its own backyard, and more attention to Asia. Japan had already emerged as an economic superpower, but in the decade between the fall of communism and the atrocities of 9/11, we all became, aware of the emergence of China, Southeast Asia, India, as centres of dynamic growth. And with that rapid economic development came new debates, which continue today, about the shifting geopolitical landscape and America and Europe's place in it. How could we relate the Western alliance to globalisation? Does that question even make sense? An indication of that shifting post-Cold War focus came in that powerful foreign affairs article written by Secretary Rice before the Bush administration first came to power back in 2000. In that article, and for those of you that haven't read it, I do draw attention to it because it is one of the most important pieces that was written at the end of the last century and the beginning of this. She argued that the US should rely less on multilateral fora and more on itself to defend its key interests. Military power mattered. The US should bolster its supremacy. This was the best way to guarantee global peace and stability. The headline issues for her and for the US then were China, a strategic competitor strong enough to challenge the balance of power in Asia. Russia, no longer a strategic threat to the US, but still of great strategic concern because of the post-communist political upheaval and uncertainty about the security of its WMD arsenals. NATO, which needed adaptation to the post-Cold War age. And rogue nations, unpredictable actors with WD ambition, such as Iraq, North Korea, Iran. Dr. Rice argued that these threats and uncertainties could not be countered by Cold War concepts of deterrence, hence the need for missile defence and withdrawal from the ABM Treaty. Some concluded that the clear implication of this was that with the end of the communist threat in Europe, Europe itself was in eclipse. Europe will continue to act with the US in defence of shared values around the world, but it would no longer be the cockpit in which the fate of those values would be decided. And at the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, in a Europe that was now free from the threat of the Soviet Union, perspectives and priorities were changing. The walls came down, contacts were restored. Western Europe began to develop a positive relationship with Eastern Europe for the first time in decades. Germany was focused on a monumental political, economic and psychological task of reunification. the EU was faced with the challenge of reaching out to and ultimately, successfully, bringing into that union a succession of new member states, many from the former communist bloc, and all of whom had, at some stage in their history, been locked in conflict rather than negotiation. Of course, today, now, they are bound together in a union that provides a stable democratic grouping of some 450 million Europeans. But the scale of the change in Europe and the speed with which it has taken place meant that much of our time and energy was spent on our own affairs, wrestling with the complexities of enlargement, coming to terms with the challenge of managing business in a union that over 40 years has grown from 6 to 25 countries, with 2 more, Romania and Bulgaria, due to join at the beginning of next year. And in NATO too, the rock upon which the security of the relationship had been built over 50 years, many things were changing. The end of the Cold War meant the alliance needed to adapt to a Europe in which countries no longer confronted each other, but were building the structures of cooperation, to the new security threats posed by ethnic conflict, failing states, religious extremism. An alliance for fighting a conventional war across the battlefields of Europe had to change or fade away. But NATO defied the sceptics. In 15 years, it transformed itself from an alliance focused on Article 5 territorial defence of the West against the Warsaw Pact, to an alliance that provides the forum for discussion of a wide range of security issues and takes common action to deal with them. That path was not always smooth, but the old arguments about out of area have gone. NATO is now involved in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in training forces in Iraq. It has increased its membership to include former members of the Warsaw Pact. It has modernised its command structure. It has set up a NATO reaction force aimed at dealing swiftly and effectively with crises wherever they develop. And it has developed new relations with its neighbours through Partnership for Peace, the NATO-Russia Council, and most recently the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. The shifts that took place in the period immediately after the Cold War were not always apparent at the time, the implications not always understood. The unfolding drama in the Soviet Union, the crisis in the Balkans following the breakup of Yugoslavia, all ensured intensive US-European consultation that often led to high-profile common action. August 1991 arguably marked the end of the Cold War, when a coup against Gorbachev failed and the collapse of the Soviet Union became inevitable. But 10 years later, on September 11, 2001, the first post-Cold War chapter was closed. It ushered in a new era when, with the horror of the images of the Twin Towers before us, we realised we were faced with the threat of terrorism perpetrated by extremists who gravely distort Islam to justify their fanaticism. There was huge revulsion worldwide at the 9/11 attacks, huge sympathy for the American people. But what there perhaps was not in Europe was a full appreciation of the psychological impact of the attacks on the American people. The determination of US security policymakers to ensure that the United States would get to the terrorists before they got to America led to the debate on Iraq. We know that the transatlantic unity so evident in the aftermath of 9/11 became strained and then frayed by the arguments that followed. I don't propose to rehearse them again here. I'm happy to discuss them afterwards in the Q&A if you wish. But I would like to recall 2 things. First, that despite what the media and others may say today, the argument in 2002 was not about whether Saddam was running a murderous dictatorship, nor about whether he had weapons of mass destruction. We all, including President Chirac in France, thought that he did. It was over what to do about it. And second, that a significant majority of European countries supported the Iraq War and provided assistance either in the form of troops or logistics to help fight it. Before the Iraq War, we focused too little on the differences among allies. Since Iraq, we have focused on them too much. The transatlantic relationship has suffered because of arguments over Iraq, and there has been a tendency to list other issues, from climate change to trade disputes, all of which I will come on to later, to point to what some argue is a growing gulf, and to what those at the pessimistic end of the scale claim point to the terminal decline of the alliance itself. I would not argue that we do not face serious problems within the alliance and across the Atlantic. We do. Recognising the fact is an essential first step to dealing with those problems. But let us not forget, this is not the first time. Suez, Vietnam, the deployment of short-range nuclear missiles to Europe in the 1980s, Bosnia, Kosovo, have all led to heated debates over the last 40 years. So the question is not whether we have arguments within the alliance, it is how we manage them, and whether we still have the will and resilience to resolve them and move on. My view is that we have, and I believe it is essential that we should. Much is going on, as it always has, that we are doing together, but it does not make headlines. Counter-terrorism cooperation is at the centre of daily transatlantic business, as is cooperation on counter-proliferation. We have worked well together too on a wide range of foreign policy issues over the last few years, leading to the first free elections in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon, persuading Libya to give up its WMD, rolling up AQ Khan's nuclear network, and most recently on Iran. And we must remember too that our prosperity is interdependent. The trade and financial flows across the Atlantic are of an extraordinary magnitude. 3 quick statistics for you. The US invested $3.2 billion in China and Hong Kong last year, compared to $30.5 billion in the UK alone. 10 times as much. Two-way trade in goods and services between the EU and US last year was worth over $400 billion US dollars. The Bureau of Economic Analysis in Washington estimates that 7 million US jobs are directly supported by EU investment. Visible trade between the US and EU last year was worth $50 billion. So, with that in mind, how do we solidify the transatlantic alliance? And what should its purpose be as we move forward? In my view, the answer is for the US and Europe to construct a common agenda to work together on. None of us want friendly relations purely for friendly relations' sake. Nor will we improve the transatlantic alliance simply by wringing our hands over it. What matters is that we all, Europeans and Americans alike, face challenges that are too urgent to ignore, too global and too complex to face alone. So, the core of what we might call a New Deal between Europe and America needs to be constructed around global problems that affect us all and demand that we work together. What should this consist of? Some thoughts. Terrorism, obviously, proliferation, covering issues as diverse as Iran and Pakistan. Resolution of conflict, in particular the debilitating Israel-Palestine dispute with the impact it has on relations between the Islamic and the non-Islamic world. Support for democratic reform around the world, and particularly in the wider Middle East with countries of the region. The development agenda, tackling poverty, promoting good governance, respect for human rights and the rule of law, essential to prevent the emergence of a rising number of failing states. Overcoming the threat posed by climate change in ways that are fair both to the developed world and the developing countries. Environmental sustainability is not an option, it is a necessity. For economies to flourish, for global poverty to be banished, for the well-being of the world's people to be enhanced, we have a compelling duty of stewardship to take care of the natural environment and resources on which our economic activity and social fabric depends. And this challenge is interlinked with a hot topic today, the need to ensure adequate supplies of energy. With high oil and gasoline prices, energy security has come to the front of that agenda. This list is indicative. There are many other issues we could add. I'm sure you can think of them. We should add things such as HIV/AIDS. But a New Deal or consolidated agenda of this kind, and one on which we are working closely with the US government now, will reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship, promote closer consultation and cooperation between the US and Europe, and commit us to dealing together with the difficult and often dangerous challenges that we face. We understand that a New Deal of this type brings huge responsibilities for Europe too. Europe benefits when there is close consultation and multilateral cooperation across the Atlantic. But we must, for our part, be ready to share the political, economic and military burdens with the United States. Having identified a core agenda and working together on it, we must then decide how to implement the common policies. That does not mean new machinery. We have enough of it already. It means advocating the intensive and imaginative use of the machinery that exists and has served us well for so many years. NATO, the Group of 8 industrialised countries, the European Union, to name 3 of the key organisations. And this is all very relevant because last year in 2005, my own country, the United Kingdom, was able to push forward this agenda. We had the presidency of the Group of 8 industrialised countries for the whole year and the rotating EU presidency from July to December. And we worked hard to promote that close cooperation across the Atlantic with, I think, a lot of success. Together with the United States, we focused on the most pressing global issues with varying degrees of success. And I'd like to highlight 3 of them here for you today: Africa, climate change, and the Middle East. A word on Africa. A continent burdened with many problems. We need to tackle them with a new urgency. Poverty, instability, debt, disease, the list is daunting. We need an Africa where there is the prospect of growing prosperity, not an Africa where many countries are as poor as they were 40 years ago. We need an Africa where life expectancy is rising, not falling back to levels last seen in the 1930s because of HIV and AIDS. There is, of course, a moral imperative here, and an imperative that the Prime Minister Tony Blair talks about a lot. But there is also a security dimension. If we are not ready to help Africa, we risk more failed states, with the instability they bring, the threats they pose, breeding grounds for terrorism, crime, drug running, arms dealing. And we can work closely together on African issues. We have done so in the past, in West Africa, on Sierra Leone and Liberia, and on Côte d'Ivoire, in Central Africa in the Congo, and in East Africa in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And at the moment we are working closely together to try to bring to an end the horrific events in Sudan. What more could we do? Some more ideas. Establish early warning and preventive mechanisms to avert human rights abuses and political instability. The more successful we are, the better the chances of avoiding crises that may demand military intervention. The poverty, debt, development and good government agendas, there is further scope for us to work together. We should expand efforts to build and train regional peacekeeping forces within Africa so that Africans are empowered to prevent crises or deal with them when they erupt. And we have had some success on that in Sudan with the African Union recently. There is a long way to go, but we are at least moving in the right direction. Question whether we may be able to establish a joint US-European civilian task force to be deployed to African states if we are asked to help in a crisis, and look to help ensure effective UN responses to Africa's needs. It won't be quick, it won't be easy, but the rewards will be great for Africans themselves and for the wider international community. The second issue on which we focused during our G8 presidency was climate change. The Prime Minister has described it as the greatest environmental threat that we face. As he put it, our grandchildren will face the consequences of climate change, so it falls to our generation to act, and to act now. In the UK and most of the global scientific community, we are convinced that global economy's use of hydrocarbons is the primary driver of the abrupt temperature shift and associated sea level rise. Last month, US researchers presented evidence that the Greenland ice cap had doubled its melting rate in the last 5 years. It is now estimated to be losing 220 cubic kilometres of water a year. No one country can tackle climate change on its own. It's a global problem to which we need global solutions. It can only be addressed through technological development and a robust, inclusive and binding international treaty. And any action we take must be compatible with economic growth. In particular, we cannot say to the developing countries that they must constrain their growth in the interests of the world community. And then there's the Middle East. Top of the list is the Middle East peace process. It is impossible to think of stability in the Middle East region without thinking of the Arab-Israel conflict and resolving it. We may be asking how, given Hamas's surprise election win earlier this year. I shall return to this later. But there are broader implications. Progress on the peace process will underpin the chances of success in promoting democratic reform across the region. This in turn underpins the chances of success in tackling the causes of terrorism. President Bush put the peace process at the centre of a common transatlantic approach to the Middle East during his second term. He called on Israel to help the Palestinians to build a thriving economy and ensure that a new Palestinian state is truly viable, with contiguous territory on the West Bank. Israel's withdrawal from Gaza last August was an important first step, for which former Prime Minister Sharon has received much credit, well deserved. We must, all of us in the international community, stand ready to support Prime Minister Olmert as he and his colleagues look to build on Mr Sharon's legacy. There can be no more deserving objective for our hopes and prayers. The withdrawal from Gaza means that the Palestinians now have the opportunity to chart their own destiny with help from the international community. On the Palestinian side, President Abbas needs to show that he can make the Palestinian security forces more effective. He will have the support of the international community. We welcome President Bush's announcement of an expanded security sector reform mission to follow the good work started by General Ward, now taken over by General Dayton, which has started with the Palestinians. Hamas's victory came as a surprise, perhaps even to Hamas itself. The international community is waiting to see how Hamas will respond to the heavy responsibility the Palestinian electorate has given it. But Hamas's history of violence gives us all serious cause for concern. In Europe, we believe that this violence, which is quite simply a fundamental contradiction with the building of a democratic state, has to stop. All factions, including Hamas, must renounce violence, recognise Israel's right to exist and disarm. We hope to be able to work closely with the new Palestinian Authority as a partner in peace. Hamas can be in no doubt what we expect of them if we are to build this partnership and deliver the democracy dividend. And they can be in no doubt that if they fail to deliver this, then they will abdicate the support from the West. Afghanistan is an area where we have worked closely together since 9/11. A stable and prosperous Afghanistan will encourage stability and prosperity in the region. An Afghanistan free from the influence of terrorism can only benefit the rest of the world. In 2001, the international community freed Afghanistan from the tyranny of the Taliban regime. But that was only the beginning. Look at the progress since then. In 2004, Afghanistan elected a president in free and fair elections for the first time in its history. In 2005, Afghanistan held its first parliamentary and provisional elections for 36 years. The militias have disarmed, the schools have reopened, women and girls again have access to education and healthcare. Real achievements, and they come with real implications for real people. We have worked together to achieve this goal, not least through the NATO mission in Afghanistan. And last month in London, President Karzai, Kofi Annan and Tony Blair launched the Afghan Compact. That provides a framework for the engagement of the international community in Afghanistan for the next 5 years. Another area where we have been cooperating closely is Iran, which has become a source of significant international concern. Iran claims that it has no nuclear weapons ambition. 18 years of Iranian clandestine nuclear activity means that the international confidence can be based only on Iranian actions, not words. In October 2003, the E3, France, Germany and the United Kingdom, persuaded Iran to suspend its work to develop the nuclear fuel cycle. In August, Iran decided to reject a very generous European offer of political security and economic incentives in exchange for a permanent suspension. Not only did Iran reject that offer, but it unilaterally walked away from its agreement with the E3, restarted its uranium conversion facility, and broke the IAEA seals at its pilot uranium enrichment plant. Transatlantic unity has been at the heart of our strategy to deal with Iran. President Bush speaks openly of his appreciation for European efforts and for European leadership. The US has wholeheartedly backed our call to refer Iran to the UN Security Council and has worked closely with us as we have taken that forward in New York. And we must continue to preserve that unity. With it in place, there will be a chance of building broader international support as we press Iran to reverse its decisions and come back to the negotiating table. Without it, the chances of success are slim to non-existent. So, the transatlantic relationship is as important as ever if we are to resolve the global problems we face. The problems are very different, and in many ways much more difficult than in those of the Cold War era when we had a common, visible enemy. But our common values have not changed, nor has our need to work together. The issues are beyond any of us, even this most remarkable nation, to deal with alone. We have machinery that is time-tested, that has served us well, and has adapted well to changing circumstances. But a cooperative and productive transatlantic relationship is not a gift, nor is it a given. Saying that it remains critical is not a guarantee of its good health. We have to work at it and look after it with constant commitment, communication at all levels, respect for differences when they occur, and a determination to exploit to the full the much greater areas where we agree. The tensions during the last few years should remind us all how much is at stake, how much we have to lose if the transatlantic relationship disappears. When we work together, the problems shrink. When we don't, they block out much of the horizon. Thank you, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Why would you say the United Kingdom, out of all the European countries, especially those in the European Union, has the best relationships with the U.S. at this time?
I guess the first answer to that, of course, is history. It probably wasn't always the case. I guess for a period around the time of independence that you probably had better relations with France. But apart from then, I think one can look at the history, the closeness of the relationship over the last 200, 300, 400 years. In fact, of course, next year, 2007, will be the 400th anniversary of the first permanent English settlement in Jamestown in southern Virginia. Going back to history, the experiences that we shared at the end of World War I, in World War II, in the 20th century, in the Cold War, and since. And then I think today the closeness of the relationship is also about personalities. I think it's about the personality 20 years ago of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I think today it's about the personalities of Tony Blair and first Bill Clinton and now George W. Bush. I think we see common values, common beliefs, and a desire to move forward and work together to try and resolve the huge amounts of difficulty and problems that we face in international affairs. But it goes much wider than international affairs. We also have extraordinarily close links domestically, and we have which we push very hard in the embassy in Washington and around our network in the United States, what we call best practice, something that is reciprocated by the American Embassy in London and American consulates around the United Kingdom, looking for things that each of us do really well and where we can learn from each other's successes and indeed failures. So I think it clearly is a very close relationship, and it goes back, as I say, through history and to the shared values.
In those cases where there is disagreement between the UK and the United States, what leverage or possibilities for resolution in such areas perhaps as the environment, where the US is a non-signatory of the Kyoto Agreement, how can you then work with the 5,000-pound gorilla in the room, so to speak?
A good question. Answer is, of course, through talking, through contact. I think we very early on we accepted and recognised that the US was not going to sign up to Kyoto. I mean, quite frankly, if the British government had been in the same position as the American government, we wouldn't have signed up to Kyoto. Not as it turned out. So what you do is you sit down with government inside the Beltway in Washington, and you work out ways that we can work together and move forward on those agendas where we do have some disagreements. I think actually on climate change that we've come much closer together. There was a big push by the Prime Minister when we had the presidency of the G8 last year, and the summit meeting that we had in Glen Eagles, we were able to agree some really important ways to move forward on climate change, looking forward to post-Kyoto, looking forward to 2012 with some kind of new international agreement on emissions, but an agreement that the United States government will, whichever party, will be able to sign up to without actually threatening the US economy, which is one of the reasons I think in my speech I said that when moving forward together on climate change, we have to address it, but we also have to do so in a way that doesn't affect international economic growth. There are, of course, other issues where we disagree. Guantanamo is an issue where we have had public disagreements. But the great thing about friends and allies is that you can sit down and you can talk about these and try and resolve them in private, outside the public glare. It's only when it hits the public and you start to have major disagreements all over the media that you begin to have real problems. All the time you can continue to talk about these. There are always ways that you can find to resolve them. Again, going back to the previous question, actually, particularly between London and Washington, because our ties are so close.
Would your country prefer to see maybe a more integrated Europe and a stronger European constitution being accepted by all the countries, or does it like its current stance with France and Germany kind of being the dominant force, or would expansion bring more power to you guys, or how do you see that form coming out in the next couple of years?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think that one could say there's probably there has been for a few years a slight disconnect between what the British public wants and maybe what members of the British government want. So I'll give you an answer which reflects as much my own personal view as my government's view, although it is my government's view as well. And that is that what we really need in Europe, and what Europe has been so hugely successful at, has been expansion. It's been all about bringing in countries into the European Union from Central and Eastern Europe. Before that, of course, the countries such as Spain and Portugal and Greece. And by bringing them into the European Union for two main reasons. One, to consolidate the whole issue of democracy, human rights, the rule of law. It's very, very easy now to forget that, 2005, it's only 30 years since General Franco died in Spain. Now, those of you that have been to Spain today, and I was fortunate enough to go to Spain when I was quite very young in the 1970s, and the difference between Spain in the 1970s and Spain today is just phenomenal. I mean, they are two completely different countries. And that has largely come about because of the influence of the European Union on Spain. It is the same in Greece. It will now be the same in countries such as Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary, and next year Bulgaria and Romania as they sign up and they join the European Union. And that's why, in my government's view, it is so critical that we have a path to allow Turkey to come into the European Union. It won't be tomorrow, it won't be next year, but within the next 10 to 15 years. We must bring Turkey into the European Union. We must even look at bringing countries like Ukraine into the European Union, to consolidate the democracies in those countries, to consolidate the economic growth, the approach to economics, the free market economic policies that those governments are now beginning to pursue, to push forward. Because only by doing that can you ensure the long-term objective of peace and stability. Somebody once told me that the great thing about democracies is that no two democracies have ever gone to war against each other. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, although nobody's ever come up and said to me, no, that isn't true, and this is a good example of where it has happened. And it may well be, if you go back to Roman times, you can probably find examples that disprove that theory. But on the whole, I think it's a pretty good point, and it's a reason why we must continue to expand the European Union. This is not going to happen overnight. We're not going to suddenly see countries such as Germany or Finland double the percentage they spend on defence. But what you are seeing is that as the ESDP is now has 14 operations around the world, and what we're seeing is that when we decide as the European Union to have an operation. I'll give you an example. We have an operation in Aceh, for example, in Indonesia. Then we look around Europe for countries to put forces in. And what you're seeing is, for the first time ever, countries such as Ireland actually sending forces abroad. Now, in doing that, they are obviously NATO and the European Union are different in that they have different memberships. What we have in the European Union now, of course, is the what we call ESDP, European Security Defence Policy approach, which allows us to actually carry out military operations as the European Union. But that is tied, and I won't get into the detail because it is long and boring, but it's tied through a process that we refer to as Berlin Plus, into command chains of NATO to ensure that the two move forward together. But I think it does reflect the importance of the European Union actually developing its own defence force and its own security and defence capability. And I think that for the United Kingdom, one of the most important reasons to push that forward is because for too many years now, it is the United States and the United Kingdom, and to a lesser extent France, that has had to bear the cost of NATO. The United States, of course, the huge cost. Much of the funding and operational personnel for NATO comes from the United States, but also from the UK and say from France and one or two other smaller countries. And I think the great thing about the European Defence Force is that this is forcing European governments to accept that they too are going to have to start to use a certain percentage of their GDP on defence, rather than relying on the United States protective umbrella, or indeed protection from the UK or one or two of the other stronger military powers in Europe. But none of this, having said that, none of this should move away from the need to ensure that the European Defence Force and NATO move forward together, parallel, side by side, working together when necessary, and certainly at no stage ever working against each other.
You just made the comment that it's somewhat forcing states to put more into military, and it seems like it's been around since about 1999, and I haven't seen much growth in military spending. Is that because Europe's been in recession, many of the countries, or how is it really, I mean, does it really force states to put more into military, or is it just more rhetoric?
I think it does make countries put more into military expenditure. This is not going to happen overnight. We're not going to suddenly see countries such as Germany or Finland double the percentage they spend on defence. But what you are seeing is that as the ESDP is now has 14 operations around the world, and what we're seeing is that when we decide as the European Union to have an operation. I'll give you an example. We have an operation in Aceh, for example, in Indonesia. Then we look around Europe for countries to put forces in. And what you're seeing is, for the first time ever, countries such as Ireland actually sending forces abroad. Now, in doing that, they are through that process having to increase the amount of money they spend on their defence capability. So it's going to be a very gradual process as we move forward, but it will be undoubtedly it will lead to increased expenditure. This doesn't mean that we're going to have any countries in Europe spending 10 to 15% of their GDP on defence, but what it might mean is you'll see an increase from 0.5 to 0.7 or 0.8, which will overall allow them to share the security requirements for Europe as well as outside that theatre.
I'm kind of interested in knowing what you think about how the European Union, or more specifically the United States and the United Kingdom, will face the increase of products and labor in China, and how that's going to affect our markets. And I guess the example I have is in Europe, Italy, the whole shoe industry and retail.
I think it's something that we're all very much aware of. I think fundamentally it will come down to market forces, but of course it's really using the World Trade Organization to ensure level playing fields. So you have the situation as you've had recently where the WTO have found against the Chinese over their exchange rate, artificially set low in order to increase the ability to export. And I think those are the kind of areas that we're going to have to work, the inevitable difficulties that we're going to face from China and indeed from India and from other developing countries over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. It's certainly a concern in Europe, less of a concern there than it is here. One of the things that I find very interesting about China is that for many, many years, in fact until last year really, the European Union as an entity didn't really focus on China. The focus was much more on the Middle East, on North America, perhaps a little bit on Latin America for historical reasons through the Spanish and Portuguese, and on Africa because of the historical interests from London and Paris. But in the last year or two, the European Union has begun to focus on Asia and begun to talk to the United States government about dealing with China and dealing more widely with Asia. And that to me is critical, because if the Europeans really do have a view of playing a role internationally, then they have to be prepared to play that role internationally. They can't just cherry pick certain parts of the world. So China has really increased in Europe. The visibility of China has really increased in Europe, and I think that was one of the reasons why we've actually had quite a lot of success in the WTO against China over the last year or so, because there are no longer really big differences between Washington and Europe on how to handle the problems that we're facing economically and commercially from there.
I was reading about EU and Latin American economic relations, and I was just wondering how you think the United States and the European Union should respond to sort of the outspoken criticism coming from Venezuela, and especially the recent nationalization of Bolivia's petroleum and natural gas reserves.
Yeah, that's a really good topical question. I think the first thing I would say about Latin America is I think we have to be very, very careful not just to lump all left-wing leaders in Latin America together, because clearly there are some really big differences between, for example, Lula in Brazil and Chavez or Morales or Kirchner. The second thing I would say is that my own government tends to look at Latin America a little bit through the microscope of Argentina for obvious historical reasons and concerns that we may have there. But I think that the important thing that we must do when dealing with people like Chavez is to avoid getting into public slanging matches with him, public disagreements, because at the end of the day there's only really going to be one winner, and in a sense we just drop ourselves to that level. I think what you have to do with countries like Venezuela is what we've done quite successfully, is to try and isolate them internationally. We had the elections for the Human Rights Council in the United Nations earlier this week, and there were some very strange results. But one of the interesting things was that Venezuela ran for that council but failed to get on. And one of the reasons it failed to get on was because there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes from Europeans and the United States to ensure that they didn't get onto that council. And I think it's ways like that that you have to try and reduce the effectiveness of populists like Chavez internationally. In the case of Bolivia, I think, again, we have to just stay cool. Morales has gone down the road of nationalisation. I mean, frankly, we all know it's going to be a disaster for Bolivia. He's determined to do it. There's nothing we can do to stop him realistically. We just have to let that play out. He will have to suffer the consequences. That's tough. It's tough on the Bolivian people, but there's very little that we can or should be doing. He was elected. He was elected in free elections. You don't have the same question marks, frankly, about his election that you do over Chavez. He'll have to learn through his own mistakes.
Could you address the current crisis in Iran and what the EU's best outcome would be with dealing with their nuclear aspirations?
Obviously, the best outcome would be for them to turn around tomorrow and say, you guys are right, we're going to stop, we're not going to try and develop a nuclear capability. That's not going to happen. So we have to think about how best to manage this. And I think at the moment our vessel of choice remains the United Nations. It's tough. The meeting earlier this week with the P5 foreign ministers showed it's difficult, particularly working with the Russians. But I think we have to keep on pressing and trying to work through the United Nations. I think we must remember, and a point that we need to keep on making in those negotiations to the Russians, is that it can't possibly be in Russia's interests for Iran to develop a nuclear capability. We have to find ways of preventing them from moving forward. My own view is that all we can really do is to slow them down. I think that it is almost impossible now, short of a full-scale land invasion of Iran over a long period of time, to prevent them from actually developing a nuclear capability. The question then, however, will be whether they only use that nuclear capability, as they claim, for domestic energy supply, or whether they take the one step forward and begin to produce a weapon. I think, you will not be surprised to hear me say that my guess is the latter. But at the moment, at least, I think we have to keep on trying to work this through the international community, through the United Nations Security Council, and through the IAEA board.
And that the US and the UK are working. I was wondering, what specifically are they doing to try to help the situation there?
It's UK, US, but also Europe. One of the things that I did, of course, was to sponsor the Abuja peace talks and to push really hard to try and get an agreement to come out of that. And when it looked as though the rebel groups were going to walk away, there was huge pressure on them, not only from Deputy Secretary Zelik, but also from the UK representative to those talks, our development minister, USAID equivalent, was in Abuja. Went to Abuja specifically with Deputy Secretary Zelik to put pressure on the rebel groups not to walk away, and ultimately we were successful in getting at least some of them to sign up to the agreements. So that's one thing we're doing. The other thing we're doing is working very hard in the United Nations to prepare them to move from the AMIS mission, the Africa Union mission, on the ground, to blue hatting, a UN mission at the end of this year. And that will mean effectively looking at ways to help the UN with logistics. Interestingly, this comes back to the question that you asked about whether we go down the route of NATO logistical help, largely lift, i.e. getting the people, the UN forces into the theatre, or whether we do it as Europeans under ESDP, and that is an issue that we are talking to the United States about at the moment. But we're working hard on that. Also working very hard with the Sudanese government in Khartoum to stop the atrocities that the government forces are carrying out. And finally, we've been working extremely hard both in Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the Africa Union, but also around Africa, to help give the Africans the ability to be able to resolve this conflict themselves, which they have tried to do. And I think that they have not been absolutely successful, but the success that they have had is a very good sign for their getting involved in future conflicts in Africa. Something that I referred to in the speech that we really want to try and achieve.